Hey there, viewers. Before we dive into this story, let me know in the comments where are you tuning in from and what time is it on your end. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories reach. Now buckle up, because this one might just leave you questioning everything. Chapter 1. The Call to Interrogate. The fluorescent lights in the narrow hallway buzzed faintly as I made my way toward the interrogation room. My steps echoed off the concrete walls, each one carrying the weight of what was ahead. The request to lead this case had come suddenly, an unexpected assignment that seemed almost too big to be real. But the moment I saw the file with Sean Combs' name on the cover, thick with allegations, reports, and sealed documents, I knew there was no turning back. I paused outside the steel door, gripping the folder tightly in my hand. My reputation as someone who could crack even the most unbreakable subjects had preceded me, and now it felt like a curse. They hadn't chosen me by accident. This wasn't just another case. This was him. The guard stationed outside nodded grimly, pressing the button to unlock the door. It slid open with a low hiss, revealing the room beyond. Behind it was stark and cold, illuminated only by a single light hanging low over the metal table in the center. The walls were painted a dull gray, designed to absorb sound and reflection, giving the space a suffocating quality. On one side of the table sat Sean Combs, Diddy to the world, an untouchable mogul to some, and now, to many, a man accused of unspeakable acts. He leaned back in his chair with an air of unsettling calm, his fingers steepled under his chin. His orange jumpsuit did nothing to diminish the aura of power he radiated. His gaze locked onto me the moment I stepped inside, his eyes sharp and unflinching, like a predator sizing up its prey. "Here," he said smoothly, his voice carrying an almost disarming warmth. "Glad to see they sent their best." I ignored the bait and took my seat across from him, laying the folder on the table. The chair creaked as I sat down, a faint reminder of how the environment around us felt like it was on the verge of cracking under the tension. "Mr. Combs," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "We're here to talk. Let's start with that." He smirked, leaning forward slightly. "Talk? Sure, we can talk. But let's not pretend this is just another day at the office for you." I didn't respond. That was exactly what he wanted, a reaction. Instead, I flipped open the folder, revealing a stack of documents. The pages were filled with detailed accounts, evidence, and timelines that painted a damning picture of a man who had spent decades bending the world to his will. "You've been accused of some very serious crimes," I began, keeping my voice steady. "This is your chance to give your side of the story." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "My side of the story? You think that's what this is about?" There was something unnerving about how comfortable he seemed, as though the steel cuffs around his wrists were little more than an inconvenience. "This room, this setup, you sitting there with your little folder, it's cute. Really," he continued, his tone dripping with condescension. "But let's not kid ourselves. You know as well as I do that the truth isn't what matters here." "Not." I leaned forward, meeting his gaze. "What does matter then?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he sat back, his smirk fading into something darker. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. "I'll tell you what matters," he said finally, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Power, control, that's all this has ever been about." I felt a chill creep up my spine, but I pushed it aside. "Is that how you justify what you've been accused of? Trafficking, exploitation, coercion, the so-called freak-off parties, the surveillance? You call that control?" His expression didn't waver. If anything, he looked amused. "You think those words mean something?" he said. "Trafficking, exploitation, coercion, big, scary words you throw around to make people feel righteous. But let me ask you something, Agent. Do you really think I'm the only one? Or do you think I'm just the one they've decided to put in this chair today? I didn't flinch, though his words hit harder than I cared to admit. This isn't about anyone else, I said firmly. This is about you. He laughed, a low, humorless sound that echoed off the walls. No, it's about who you think I am. And let me tell you something. You don't have a clue. Not yet. For the first time since I walked into the room, I felt the full weight of what I was up against. This wasn't just a man defending himself against accusations. This was someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of control, someone who had built an empire on the backs of others and knew exactly how to twist the narrative to his advantage. But I couldn't let him dictate the terms of this conversation. I had to stay in control. Let's talk about specifics, I said, flipping to the first page in the file. The parties, the surveillance, the allegations of underage victims being coerced and trafficked. Start with that. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but it was enough to tell me I'd struck a nerve. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. You want specifics, he said, his voice low and measured. Fine, I'll give you one. Nobody does anything unless someone lets them. Remember that? The cryptic remark hung in the air like a lead weight, and I couldn't help but feel like he was leading me down a rabbit hole I wasn't prepared for. Who's letting this happen? I pressed. He tilted his head slightly, his smirk returning. That's the real question, isn't it? But you won't like the answer. The room felt colder suddenly, the air heavier. I had interrogated some of the worst criminals imaginable, people who had done unspeakable things, but there was something uniquely chilling about the way Diddy spoke. He wasn't just deflecting, he was planting seeds of doubt, turning the focus away from himself and onto something much larger. But I couldn't let him steer the conversation. Not yet. May I? You've been accused of using surveillance to blackmail victims, I said, my voice firm, of trafficking women across state lines, of coercing them into acts they didn't consent to. These aren't just allegations, they're supported by evidence. Exercising, the director raised his voice. His eyes narrowed slightly, though his smirk didn't fade. Evidence, he repeated, almost mockingly. You mean the stuff that can be twisted, edited, manipulated? You think that's enough to take me down? It's a start, I said, refusing to back down. He leaned back, the cuffs on his wrists clinking softly against the table. You're playing a dangerous game, Agent, he said, but I'll give you credit. You've got guts. Not many people would sit across from me and try to make this stick. I met his gaze, refusing to let him see the unease building in my chest. This isn't about me, I said. It's about the people you've hurt, the lives you've destroyed. The refined on the left side of his computer screen went dark. For the first time, his smirk faded entirely, replaced by something colder, harder. You think you know me, he said, his voice low and venomous, but you don't. Not yet. The words lingered as the room fell silent once more. I could feel the weight of them pressing down on me, but I pushed it aside. This was only the beginning, and I had a long way to go. As I closed the folder and prepared to press him further, one thought consumed me. I had walked into this room prepared to face a criminal, but I was beginning to realize I might be facing something far more dangerous. And whatever lay ahead, I wasn't sure I was ready for it. Chapter 2. Diddy's Demeanor. The moment I sat back down across from him, it became clear that the man wasn't just calm. He was thriving. The small, sterile room might have felt like a cage to most, but to Diddy it was a stage. He leaned back in his chair, his posture loose, his expression almost amused. The faintest trace of a smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, like he was watching a game unfold exactly as he expected. "You look tense," he said, his voice smooth and measured. "Didn't think you'd be nervous." I ignored the jab, meeting his gaze with practiced detachment. It was a tactic I'd seen before: establish dominance early, make the other person doubt themselves. But this wasn't some small-time con artist trying to bluff his way out of trouble. This was a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of control, and I could feel it in every word he spoke. "You seem comfortable," I replied, keeping my tone even. "Well, wouldn't I be?" He shrugged, the chains around his wrists clinking softly. "This isn't my first time being misunderstood." Misunderstood. The word hung in the air, heavy with irony. The file in front of me painted a very different picture, a history of calculated manipulation, exploitation, and coercion that went far beyond a simple misunderstanding. "Let's cut to the chase," I said, leaning forward slightly. "You're facing serious charges: trafficking, coercion, racketeering, the kind of charges that can put someone away for life." He tilted his head, studying me like I was a puzzle he was trying to solve. "And yet, here I am," he said, his voice laced with mockery. "Sitting across from you, calm as ever. Makes you wonder why, doesn't it?" It did, and that was the problem. Most people in his position would be defensive, desperate to explain themselves or plead their innocence. But did he? He wasn't defensive at all. If anything, he seemed to be enjoying himself. "Well, don't you tell me," I said, refusing to take the bait. He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You good, I'll give you that. But you're asking the wrong questions." "And what are the right questions?" His smirk widened slightly, his eyes gleaming with something I couldn't quite place. "You already know the answer," he said cryptically. "But you don't want to admit it." "Not yet. But when you do, if you succeed with this exercise, you can draw conclusions others can believe in. Not yet. Not when you establish restorative sleep. If you believe your answers, your answers." His face turned serious. I leaned back, my mind racing to decipher his words. Every gesture, every remark felt calculated, like he was playing a game only he knew the rules to. "This isn't a game," I said firmly. "You've been accused of ruining lives, of exploiting people, of trafficking minors, of orchestrating events that destroyed families. That's not something you can just talk your way out of." He didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward, his smirk fading into something colder. "And what makes you think I'm trying to talk my way out of anything?" The question caught me off guard, and I hated the way it made my stomach tighten. "This isn't the first time someone's come after me," he continued, his tone soft but menacing. "You think you're the first person who's tried to put me in a box, tried to make sense of things they don't understand?" I stayed silent, letting him speak. "That's the problem with people like you," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You see the pieces, but you don't see the whole puzzle. You think you're in control because you're holding the box, but the picture on it, that's not what the puzzle really looks like." It was a strange metaphor, but somehow it felt disturbingly accurate. "What are you trying to say?" I asked, my voice steady despite the unease creeping into my chest. He leaned back again, his smirk returning. "I'm saying you're in over your head, Agent. You've been brought here to play a role in something much bigger than you realize, and the sooner you accept that, the easier this will be for both of us." The words sent a chill down my spine, but I refused to let him see it. "This isn't about me," I said, my voice firm. "This is about the people you've hurt, the lives you've destroyed, the victims who deserve justice. Don't..." His eyes narrowed slightly, his smirk fading once more. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something. Anger, maybe, or frustration. but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "You think you're a hero," he said, his tone laced with disdain. "You think you're here to save the day, to bring me down, to make the world a better place. But let me tell you something, Agent. You're not the hero in this story." "Then who is?" I shot back, my patience wearing thin. He didn't answer. Instead, he sat back in his chair, his gaze unwavering as he studied me. The silence stretched between us, heavy and oppressive, until finally he spoke again. "I've spent my entire life building something," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "Something bigger than you, bigger than me, bigger than this room. And you think you can tear it all down with a few questions and a folder full of papers." "What?" "This isn't just a folder," I said, opening it and sliding one of the documents across the table. "This is evidence. Witness statements. Testimonies from people who were there, people who saw what you did, who lived through it." He glanced at the paper but didn't touch it. Instead, he looked back at me, his smirk returning. "Do you really think that matters?" he asked. "Do you really think any of this will change anything?" "Yes," I said firmly. "I do." He chuckled again, shaking his head. "You're more naive than I thought," he said. "But I'll give you credit. You've got guts. Most people wouldn't even sit across from me, let alone try to play this game." "This isn't a game," I repeated, my voice hard. "This is your life, and if you don't start talking, it's going to end in a prison cell." His smirk widened. "You think a prison cell scares me?" he asked. "You think any of this scares me? Literally, hell scares me. I think you're scared of losing control," I said, leaning forward. "I think you're scared of the truth coming out." For the first time, his smirk faltered, and I knew I'd struck a nerve. "The truth," he said quietly, almost to himself. "You think you know the truth?" "I know enough," I said. He shook his head, his smirk returning, but weaker this time. "No," he said softly. "You don't." The room fell silent again, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. I could feel the weight of his gaze, the intensity of his presence, and for a moment, I wondered if he was right. But I couldn't let him win. Not here, not now. "We're done for today," I said, standing up and closing the folder. "But we'll continue this tomorrow." He didn't say anything as I left the room, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching, waiting, calculating. As the door closed behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just stepped into something far bigger than I'd anticipated, and that whatever came next would change everything. Chapter 3: The First Cracks. The room felt colder the next day. It wasn't just the air conditioning or the sterile gray walls. It was the weight of what was left unsaid. As I stepped into the interrogation room, Diddy was already seated, his hands resting lightly on the table as though he owned the place. The faint smirk from yesterday was still there, though now it seemed sharper, more deliberate. "Back for more?" he asked, his voice dripping with mockery. I ignored the comment, setting the folder down on the table. Today I wasn't interested in his games. "Let's talk about the parties," I said without preamble. His smirk widened. "Parties? You'll have to be more specific." "The private ones," I clarified. "The ones your staff called freak-offs. The drugs, the underage guests, the coercion. Let's start there." He tilted his head, feigning confusion. "Freak-offs? That's what they're calling them now?" He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "People always like to add their own spin, don't they?" "This isn't spin," I said firmly. "We've got statements, photos, videos. You're not denying these parties happened, are you?" He leaned back in his chair, his chains clinking softly against the table. "Parties happen. People drink, they dance, they do what they do. That's not a crime. last I checked. Uh, Drugs, trafficking, and exploitation are crimes, I shot back. And that's exactly what was happening at those parties, wasn't it? He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied me. You sound so sure, he said quietly, like you've already decided what's true. Because I have the evidence, I replied, sliding a photo across the table. It was a still from one of the videos. Lavish decor, a table covered in champagne bottles and powder-filled trays, and a group of young women in the background who looked terrified rather than entertained. He didn't even glance at the photo. Evidence, he repeated, almost disdainfully. Let me tell you something about evidence, Agent. It's only as good as the story it tells. And who do you think controls that story? I have no idea. I leaned forward, refusing to be distracted. You had your staff recruit women, drug them, and force them into acts they didn't consent to. Some of them were minors. You think that story's going away just because you're sitting here acting like this is beneath you. He smirked again, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Annoyance, maybe, or a hint of unease. You've got quite the imagination, he said. But let's get one thing straight. Nobody does anything they don't want to do. Not at my parties, not anywhere. Coercion isn't consent, I snapped. You used power, drugs, and fear to get what you wanted. That's not imagination, that's fact. He blinked. For the first time, his composure faltered. It was subtle, a brief tightening of his jaw, a slight shift in his posture, but I caught it. You think power works like that? He asked, his voice quieter now. You think you just take it, force it on people? That's not how the world works, Agent. Then explain it to me, I said, pressing him. Help me understand. He leaned forward, his eyes locking on to mine. Power isn't about forcing people. It's about making them want what you want. It's about control, not just over them, but over everything around them. Their choices, their options, their world. You shape it so they think they're the ones in charge. He sighed. That's a convenient excuse, I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the chill creeping up my spine. It doesn't change what you did. He chuckled softly, shaking his head. You still don't get it, he said. Nobody does anything unless someone lets them. Not me, not you, not anyone. That's the real power. Knowing how to pull the strings without ever getting your hands dirty. I frowned, trying to make sense of his words. Was he deflecting, or was there something deeper to what he was saying? And whose strings are you pulling? I asked, my voice low. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he leaned back again, his smirk returning. You're asking the wrong questions, he said, echoing his words from the day before. Then what are the right questions? You're smart, he said. You'll figure it out. But here's a tip. Don't look at the people in the spotlight. Look at the ones holding it. That's where the real power is. His cryptic phrasing sent a shiver down my spine. He wasn't just talking about his crimes. He was hinting at something much larger, something that made my stomach churn. Exercise. Let's go back to the surveillance, I said, trying to regain control of the conversation. We know you recorded those parties. We know you used that footage to blackmail people. Care to explain that? He smiled, a cold, predatory grin that made my skin crawl. Explain what? That people do stupid things when they think no one's watching? That they'll pay anything to keep their secrets buried? You don't need me to explain that, Agent. You already know. Did you enjoy it? I asked bluntly, holding that kind of power over people. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he tapped his fingers against the table, his gaze distant. It's not about enjoyment, he said finally. It's about survival. You either play the game or you get played. And me? I don't lose. "But you're losing now," I pointed out. "You're here, in chains, facing charges that could put you away for life. Doesn't sound like winning to me." His smirk didn't waver. "You think this is the end?" he asked, his voice dripping with disdain. "This is just the beginning, Agent. You'll see." The confidence in his tone was unnerving, but I refused to let it shake me. "You can talk in riddles all you want," I said, "but at the end of the day, the truth will come out. And when it does, you'll answer for everything you've done." He leaned forward again, his eyes boring into mine. "The truth," he said softly, almost mockingly. "You have no idea what that even means." The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I couldn't stop thinking. What had I just stepped into? Chapter 4. The Systematic Control. I stayed seated, the weight of the previous exchange still settling in my chest. Across from me, Diddy leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed, as if we were discussing the weather. It wasn't confidence, it was detachment. A man who had done so much, seen so much, that nothing seemed capable of unnerving him. "You know exactly what we're talking about," I began, keeping my voice steady. "Let's discuss these so-called freak-off parties and the operations behind them." He tilted his head slightly, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Operations? Sounds like you're writing a movie script." His tone was light, mocking, but his eyes had that calculating glint again. They were parties. Fun. Extravagance. A little chaos, maybe. But that's what people want, isn't it? A night they'll never forget. "Except some of them didn't have a choice," I countered, letting the weight of my words hang in the air. Biddy's expression didn't falter. "Choice is an illusion," he said, almost casually. "You think anyone truly acts freely? People want something, they always do. Status, money, connections, and sometimes they'll do whatever it takes to get it. I didn't force them to want, I just gave them the opportunity." Instagram replied with its daily dose of positivity. The Facebook page turned red, forcedly. "Opportunity? Is that what you call coercing women with drugs and threats of violence?" His smile widened. "Coercion is such a loaded word. What I did, what I've always done, is provide an experience. Sure, there were measures in place to keep things running smoothly. Nobody wants chaos. You need order, structure, control. And control means surveillance," I pressed. "You documented everything, didn't you? The drugs, the blackmail material, the leverage over your guests." For the first time, he leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. Let me explain something. Power doesn't come from muscles or money. It comes from knowledge. Knowing what people want. Knowing what they fear. And yes, knowing their secrets." I kept my face neutral, though my stomach churned at his nonchalance. "You recorded people without their knowledge," he said. "Not just people," he corrected, his tone almost smug. "Powerful people, the kind who think they're untouchable. Celebrities, CEOs, politicians, they all came to me. They wanted the exclusivity, the decadence, and they were willing to pay for it with more than just money." I felt the anger rising, but forced it down. "You used those recordings for blackmail." "Blackmail?" he chuckled, shaking his head. "That's such an ugly word. I'd call it insurance. Everyone has skeletons, Agent. All I did was remind them where the closets are. Most people fall in line when they know someone's watching." Loud clicking and rattling from the opposite wall caught everyone's attention. They turned to see. "And the women?" I asked, my voice harder now. "The ones who didn't fall in line? The ones you drugged or threatened?" His smile faltered for a fraction of a second. It was subtle, but I caught it. "You think I'm the first person to do this?" he said, deflecting. "Look around. The world runs on compliance, on leverage. I just played the game better than most." "You're not answering the question." He shrugged. "Drugs, persuasion, surveillance. They're just tools. You think the CEOs and politicians I worked with didn't use their own? Everyone's dirty, Agent. I'm just honest about it. Honest." That word made my skin crawl. He talked about his actions like a businessman explaining quarterly profits, as if the lives ruined under his so-called empire were just collateral damage. "You call this business?" I asked. "This isn't entrepreneurship, it's exploitation." "And call it what you want," he replied. "But let me tell you something. Nobody does anything unless someone lets them. The people I dealt with, they let this happen. They needed me, for parties, for leverage, for their little fantasies. And when it all comes crashing down, they act shocked, like they didn't know exactly what they were stepping into." I didn't respond for a time. "And do you think that excuses you?" "I think it explains me," he said, leaning back again, that infuriating smirk returning. "You want to paint me as a villain? Go ahead. But I'm not the only one who's played this game. Hell, I didn't even invent the rules." His deflection was infuriating, but I could see the truth buried in his words. The surveillance, the drugs, the coercion. It was all a system, a machine built to protect his empire and the people who benefited from it. "Let's go back to the recordings," I said, steering the conversation. "How did you use them?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, Agent, if you think I'm going to hand you the playbook, you're crazier than the last guy who sat in that chair. But I'll give you this much. People in power don't like surprises, and a little footage here, a compromising photo there, it keeps everyone in check. Nobody steps out of line when they know the price." He wasn't just admitting to blackmail, he was proud of it, and the more he talked, the clearer it became that this wasn't about parties or indulgence. This was about control. Diddy's entire world was built on it, from the surveillance to the drugs to the fear he instilled in his victims and allies alike. I leaned in slightly, narrowing my eyes. "You talk like you're untouchable. But you're here now, aren't you? In this room, talking to me?" His smirk didn't fade. If anything, it grew wider. "And yet, I'm still running the game, aren't I?" The words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, I could feel the weight of everything he wasn't saying. This wasn't just a confession, it was a warning. Exercise continued. The system he'd built, the power he wielded, the secrets he held, they weren't contained in this room. They were out there, still working, still controlling, still untouchable. Sierra slid her mind into action, allowing the thoughts to flow freely. As she withdrew from afterlife, she focused on improving her mind. She focused on improving herself. And for the first time since I'd walked into the room, I felt a pang of doubt, not about my role, not about my resolve, but about whether the truth was enough to bring a man like this down. Chapter 5. The Web of Silence. The dim light above flickered as Diddy's gaze never wavered from mine. There was no intimidation in his eyes, just a cold, unnerving calm. His fingers drummed lightly on the edge of the table as he spoke, his voice smooth as ever, like he was reciting a well-rehearsed speech, one that he knew all too well. "So you're really trying to figure out how I did it?" he asked, cocking his head to one side, his smirk curling like he'd just asked a simple question. "It's not that complicated, Agent. Every empire has its foundation." I didn't respond immediately. I was trying to keep my composure. The last few hours in this room had already twisted my understanding of the case, and the further Diddy delved into his operations, the more distorted it became. I felt like I was sinking into quicksand, unable to escape the web of silence he was weaving around me. "Let me guess," he continued, leaning back in his chair, the chains around his wrists shifting with the movement. "You think it was all me? The drugs, the blackmail, the threats. But no, that's not how it works. I didn't do all this alone." I watched him, trying to decipher what he was getting at. He wasn't the same man he had been when we first started this. He wasn't afraid. If anything, he was playing a game I didn't even know the rules to. "You think these people didn't know?" he asked, his eyes glinting. "The ones who worked for me, the ones who helped set up the parties, the ones who kept things running smooth. They all knew." I shifted in my seat, my stomach tightening. I knew where this was going. "Really knew what was going on, didn't they?" I said quietly, already feeling the weight of the answer. "Oh yeah, they knew," Diddy said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "But that's the thing, Agent. Loyalty's a powerful thing, more powerful than you think." He paused, the smirk fading slightly as he leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, his gaze never leaving mine. "You ever hear the saying, 'Blood is thicker than water'?" he asked, his voice lowering to almost a whisper. "It's not just about family, it's about trust. The people who work for me, they trust me, and I trust them. They've got my back, no matter what." I felt a chill creep up my spine. "You don't get it," he said, his voice still soft but laced with authority. "You think you can break me by getting through to one or two of my people. You're wrong. You think they'll rat on me? You think they'll turn on me when the heat's on? They won't. Not for a second." I took a slow breath, trying to steady myself. This was bigger than I thought. "How do you keep them loyal?" I asked, leaning forward, my eyes narrowing. "What do you do to make sure they stay quiet?" Friedman laughed. Diddy's lips curled into a slow grin. "Simple," he said, his voice almost playful now. "You give them a reason to keep quiet. You give them a reason to protect you." "Tribes?" I asked. "Of course, money's always a part of it. But you don't just buy people. You buy their loyalty. You show them how much you need them, make them feel like they're essential. And then, when the time comes, they'll do anything for you. Anything." I swallowed hard. "But that's not the hard part," he continued. "The hard part is when you need to remind them why they're loyal in the first place." "Hell yeah." His voice dropped, becoming more chilling, more deliberate. "Sometimes you have to make them fear what happens if they don't do what you say." I frowned, the pieces clicking together. This wasn't just about money or power. This was about control, on a much deeper, more disturbing level. "It wasn't just fear?" I asked. Diddy nodded, his expression almost sympathetic now, as if he were explaining a difficult truth. "Fear is a great motivator, Agent, a necessary motivator. When people have something to lose, they'll go to great lengths to protect it. And when that something is their life, their freedom, their reputation, well, you can imagine what they'll do." My pulse quickened. "And what do you do to make sure they understand that?" He leaned in, his voice turning dark, almost conspiratorial. "I remind them. Every now and then, I let them know just how much power I have. I make them see that they're not untouchable, that no one is. That's when they understand the stakes, and that's when they stay loyal." I had to swallow the lump in my throat. This wasn't just about parties or sex tapes. It was about a man who had built an empire, not just on money, but on fear, manipulation, and absolute control. "And what happens to the ones who get scared?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Diddy shrugged, as if the answer were self-evident. They fall in line, or they fall out. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How had this man managed to build such a terrifying empire, and how had he convinced so many people to turn a blind eye to protect him at all costs? Your empire is built on silence, isn't it? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His smile returned, slow and confident. Exactly. People talk, but not when they know what's at stake. I leaned back in my chair, trying to process everything he was saying, but every time I thought I understood, he pushed it further, deeper into the abyss. I had to remind myself that I wasn't here just to understand his empire. I was here to bring it down. Several minutes later, we heard footsteps on the stairs, and the floor below began to groan with the... Who are these people, Diddy? I asked, feeling the weight of my words. Who's covering for you? He leaned back, his hands clasped together. That's the thing, Agent. They're not just covering for me. They're covering for themselves. They've built their own little empires around me. They're as deep in this as I am. And they're not going anywhere. A cold sweat formed on the back of my neck. This wasn't just a case. This wasn't just about one man's crimes. This was a system, a network so tangled and fortified that even the most powerful forces in law enforcement would have a hard time untangling it. And you think you're going to break it? Diddy asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. You think you're the one who's going to tear this down? I looked him dead in the eye, feeling the weight of the case press down on me. I will, I said, one piece at a time. Diddy chuckled, but there was no humor in it. Good luck, Agent. You're going to need it. And that was when I realized just how deep this rabbit hole went. Chapter 6, The Turning Point. I leaned forward, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. Let's talk about the trafficking allegations, I said, my voice steady. The underage victims. His smirk faltered. It was subtle, a fleeting moment where his confidence wavered. He recovered quickly, sitting back in his chair, arms crossed. His calm demeanor had been a fortress up until now, but cracks were starting to form. I already told you, he said, his voice lower now, lacking its earlier bravado. I don't do that. Never have. There was a hesitation, a flicker of uncertainty in his voice, and I intended to press on it until it gave way entirely. Then how do you explain the testimonies? I ask, keeping my tone neutral. The ones that describe what happened at your parties. The ones that say you brought in minors, drugged them, and trafficked them to people who paid for the privilege. His jaw tightened, his fingers tapping against the table again. Maybe, I said, letting the word hang in the air for a moment. But these are detailed accounts. They describe things only someone who was there would know. They name names. They point to a system you've built. That's your interpretation, he shot back, but there was a defensive edge creeping into his tone now. I studied him, waiting for the right moment. Then let's talk specifics, I said. Like the girl who ended up in the ER after one of your freak-offs. His eyes flicked toward me, a reaction he couldn't mask in time. You remember her, don't you? I pressed. She was barely conscious when she was dumped at the hospital. Overdose, bruises, internal injuries. Does that ring a bell? He didn't answer, but his silence spoke volumes. Her testimony paints a clear picture, I continued, my voice hardening. She described being taken to a private suite where she was given a drink laced with something. She said she couldn't move, couldn't scream. And then there was the filming. Does that sound familiar, Diddy? Diddy lowered her eyes. His hand clenched into a fist, the first real sign of anger breaking through his carefully crafted exterior. You don't know what you're talking about, he said, his voice sharp. Don't I? I leaned in closer, my eyes locked on his, because she remembered the room. She remembered the people, and she remembered you. I spat on the grass, my speech dribbling the edges of the paper. He slammed his hand on the table, making me flinch despite myself. "I didn't touch her," he said, his voice rising. "No one said you did," I replied calmly, letting his outburst settle. "But you knew what happened, didn't you? You knew because you were there, because you orchestrated it." She demanded that I explain myself to her, and I clarified the situation. The longer I waited, he froze, his breathing shallow, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. For the first time, he looked like a man caught in his own web. "There are always accidents," he said finally, his voice quieter, almost resigned. "Things get out of hand. People make mistakes." "Accidents?" I repeated, my voice dripping with disbelief. "Is that what you call it? An accident?" "You don't know." "You think I control everything," he snapped, his composure unraveling further. "You think I'm the only one responsible for what happens at those parties? You're out of your depth, Agent. You don't even know where to start." "Then help me understand," I said, refusing to back down. "Explain it to me. Tell me how it all works." He shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "You're looking at the wrong person," he said, his voice hollow. "You think bringing me down will fix this? You think it'll stop? It won't. Because it's bigger than me. It's bigger than all of us." "Then why not tell me who's involved?" I challenged. "If you're just a part of it, then give me the rest. Tell me their names." He stared at me, his eyes dark and unreadable. "You wouldn't believe me if I did," he said finally. "Try me," I said, my voice firm. But he just smiled, a cold, lifeless smile that sent a chill down my spine. "You don't want to know," he said, "because once you do, you'll never sleep again." "I ran through the maze with the villagers clustered around me," Tom said. The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air like a storm cloud. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. He was trying to rattle me, to throw me off my game, and I couldn't let him succeed. "Let's go back to that night," I said, steering the conversation back to the specifics. "The party where things spiraled out of control, the one you said was an accident. What happened?" He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the table for the first time. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. "It wasn't supposed to go that far," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "But things escalated." "Escalated how?" I pressed. "The girl," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "She wasn't supposed to be there. She wasn't part of the plan. But someone brought her anyway, and then things got out of hand." This was the paper that had been left in the kitchen behind the rest of the food, the combination packet with the writing instruments. "Someone brought her anyway." "The girl," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "She wasn't supposed to be there. She wasn't part of the plan." "Who brought her?" I asked, my voice steady. He didn't answer. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable once again. "You're not going to get what you're looking for," he said finally. "Not from me. I've already told you more than I should." "And yet here we are," I said, refusing to let him regain the upper hand. For the first time, he looked truly rattled. The man who had walked into this room hours ago with an air of unshakable confidence was now visibly fraying at the edges. But I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. "You think you've got the upper hand," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "But you don't. You're just a pawn in a game you can't even begin to understand." "And you?" I asked. "What are you in this game?" He smirked, but it was a hollow gesture, devoid of the arrogance he'd displayed before. "I'm the one who survives," he said simply. Ah. But as I stared at him, I saw something else. Fear. For all his bravado, for all his posturing, there was a part of him that knew the walls were closing in, and I intended to keep pushing until they collapsed entirely. Chapter 7. The Shocking Revelation. I leaned in closer, staring him down across the table. His smugness was unbearable, but I knew better than to let it rattle me. I had spent hours dissecting his lies, pressing him for truths he refused to admit, and circling around the edges of what he was hiding. Now, it felt like I was finally hitting the core of it. "You think you've seen the worst of it," Diddy said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm again, almost eerily so, like a predator toying with prey. "I don't think anything," I shot back. "I know what I've seen, and it's enough to put you away for life." He chuckled, low and cold. "Life? You don't get it, do you? Even if you lock me up, even if you throw away the key, you've done nothing. I'm just one piece on the board." "Then explain it to me," I said, keeping my tone steady. "Help me understand this game you keep talking about." He leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped in front of him as if he were settling in to tell a story. "You really want to know?" he asked, his tone almost taunting. "Yes," I said firmly. He paused for a moment, as if deciding how much to give away. Then, with a smirk, he began. "What you're looking at isn't me," he said, gesturing to himself. "It's the system, the machine. You think this is about trafficking, about parties, about a few bad nights caught on tape? This is about control." "Control," I echoed. "Control," he repeated. "Surveillance, leverage, power, it's all the same thing. You keep people in line, and they keep the system running. It's been this way for decades. Centuries, even. I'm just playing my role." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Your role?" He nodded, his smirk widening. "Every empire needs someone to do the dirty work, someone to make sure the gears keep turning no matter how ugly it gets. That's me. Or it was me." "And who's running this empire?" I asked, my voice sharper now. His eyes gleamed with something that looked like amusement. "You think I'm going to tell you that?" he said. "Come on, you're smarter than that. But I'll give you a hint. They're the people you'll never see, the ones who never make headlines, who never sit in rooms like this. The real power isn't flashy. It's quiet, invisible." Hint. Clenched my fists under the table, resisting the urge to slam my hands down in frustration. "And you're saying this invisible power allowed everything you did?" "Allowed it?" He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "They demanded it. You think those tapes, that surveillance, those parties, they were just for fun? No, they're tools, leverage. You get people to do what you want, and if they step out of line, you've got the proof to bury them." "And the trafficking?" I pressed. "The underage victims?" "Collateral," he said simply, his tone devoid of emotion. "That's the price of doing business. You want power, you want influence, you have to make sacrifices, and sometimes those sacrifices are people." I felt my stomach turn, but I forced myself to stay focused. "You're admitting to all of it, then?" He shrugged. "I'm admitting that I played my part. But don't fool yourself into thinking I'm the top of the pyramid. I'm not. I'm just a cog in the wheel, and when you take me out, someone else will take my place." I demanded. "Who's waiting to take your place?" He smiled again, that same infuriatingly smug smile. "You don't really want to know," he said, "because if you did, you wouldn't sleep at night. Trust me, agent, this rabbit hole goes deeper than you can imagine." "I don't care how deep it goes," I shot back. I'm going to dig until I hit the bottom." "Good luck with that," he said, leaning forward now, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Because the bottom doesn't exist. This machine, it protects itself. No matter how much evidence you find, no matter how many people you think you've taken down, it always survives. Always." "And what about you?" I asked. "Where does this leave you?" He tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "I'm exactly where I expected to be," he said. "Did you think I'd walk away from all this without paying a price? No, I knew the risks. But you have to understand, I'm not the one you should be afraid of. I'm just the face, the distraction. The real players, they're untouchable." "So you're untouchable?" "They're untouchable." Said the... I stared at him, trying to process the enormity of what he was saying. If he was telling the truth, and I had no reason to believe he wasn't, then this wasn't just about him. It was about something much larger, something far more dangerous. He reached into his pocket and handed me his phone. The text message was short and simple. "You're lying," I said finally, though my voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" he said, raising an eyebrow. "Then why are you sweating, Agent? Why do you look like you just saw a ghost?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. "Here's the thing," he continued, his voice calm again. "Even if you get me, even if you lock me away for the rest of my life, it won't matter. Because there's 10 more waiting to take my place, and 10 more after them. You think you're saving the world? You're not even scratching the surface." His words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. For the first time, I felt the weight of it all pressing down on me, the scope of what I was up against, the enormity of the machine he described. "You think you're so smart," he said, his tone almost pitying now. "But you're just another piece on the board. And the people who really run this game, they've already won." I sat back, the silence between us deafening. For all his arrogance, for all his games, there was a part of me that believed him. And that terrified me more than anything else he had said. "Is that it?" I asked finally, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. "Is that all you've got?" He smiled, a cold, empty smile that sent a chill down my spine. "Oh, I've got plenty more," he said. "But you're not ready for it. Not yet." I stared at him, my resolve hardening despite the fear clawing at the edges of my mind. Whatever this machine was, whatever system he claimed to be a part of, I wasn't going to stop until I tore it apart, piece by piece. Chapter 8. The arrest and fallout. The room felt colder as the guards entered, ready to escort him back to his cell. I hadn't moved from my seat, my hands still clasped on the table, my mind racing through the storm of revelations that had unfolded in this cramped, fluorescent-lit space. The air carried a weight now, a suffocating awareness of everything he had said. I watched as Diddy stood, his movements deliberate, almost theatrical. The smirk was gone, replaced by something far more unsettling. A quiet satisfaction, as though he had accomplished something in this room that I couldn't yet comprehend. "You're going to trial," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "And when the evidence hits, there's no escaping it. You'll pay for what you've done." He turned slowly, his wrists cuffed but his posture defiant. "You think that matters to me?" he asked, his voice soft, almost amused. "You think I care about this little show you're putting on?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. He leaned in closer, his eyes locking onto mine with a calm intensity that made my stomach churn. "Let me tell you something," he said. "This, me in here, you out there, this is nothing. You're playing checkers on a chessboard, and you don't even realize it." The guards nudged him toward the door, but he resisted just enough to keep his gaze fixed on me. "You've got your tapes, your files, your little victories," he continued. "Congratulations. But you haven't won, not even close." I clenched my jaw, refusing to let him see the doubt creeping into my thoughts. "You're going away for life," I said. "And that's a start." He laughed then, a hollow, chilling sound that echoed in the empty room. "Life? Sure. Lock me up, throw away the key. But you'll see, it doesn't end here. I'm just the beginning." The guards pulled him back, guiding him toward the door, but he didn't break eye contact until the last possible moment. And then he was gone, the sound of his footsteps fading into the hallway. The silence that followed was deafening. I exhaled slowly, the adrenaline that had fueled me through the interrogation now leaving a hollow ache in its place. The room felt impossibly empty, the weight of his words lingering like a specter. I glanced at the notes sprawled across the table. Names, dates, connections, all of it. Enough to bury him and the empire he had built. But it wasn't enough. Not really. He was right about one thing. He was just a piece of something much larger. A cog in a machine that thrived on silence, fear, and power. I stood, the chair scraping against the floor as I pushed it back. My reflection stared back at me from the two-way mirror, my face pale, my eyes heavy with the burden of what I now knew. Justice felt distant, abstract, like a goal that was always just out of reach. I replayed his final words in my mind. "You haven't won. I'm just the beginning." Was it a threat? A warning? Or worse, was it the truth? I gathered my notes, shoving them into a folder with shaking hands. The evidence we had would put him away, but what about the others, the ones he had hinted at, the ones he claimed were untouchable? As I turned to leave, I paused at the door, glancing back at the empty chair where he had sat. The space felt different now, hollow and haunted. In that moment, I realized something that I couldn't shake. This wasn't just an interrogation. It was a glimpse into a world I hadn't fully understood, a world that thrived in the shadows, protected by layers of power and influence. I stepped into the hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. The guards were leading him down another corridor, their voices low and professional. He glanced back once, his smirk returning as our eyes met. And then he was gone, swallowed by the endless maze of concrete and steel. As I walked away, the weight of what I'd uncovered pressed down on me. I should have felt triumphant. After all, we had enough to dismantle his empire, to expose his crimes to the world. But all I felt was dread. Because deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't the end. It wasn't even close. It was just the beginning.